The light is my strength. Is there danger? I'm here to help. I stand for the light. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. The light is my strength. I stand for the light. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Foul play. Of course. For honor. Betrayal of the light. For my father the king. Feel my wrath. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Justice has come. Certainly. Betrayal of the light. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Foul. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For my father the king. Feel my wrath. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Justice shall be done. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For Lord Oran. Foul name. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor. You are past the death. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
Our allied town is being
A
attacked!
sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. stand for the light. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. I'm here to help. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Justice has come. Feel my wrath. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course.
Our
A
allied
sound
town
plan.
is being attacked.
Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For Lord Oran. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Foul name. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Feel my wrath. For honor.
Our allies
Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Betrayal of the light. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Justice shall be done. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. I stand for the light. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. You are past redemption. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For my father, the king. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. help. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For Lord Oran. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
You are past redemption. Betrayer of the light.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
Our hero has been slain. Our allies' hero has been slain.
I stand for the light. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. The light is my strength. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
Our
Certainly.
allied town is being attacked.
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. I'm here to help. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
Our allied
For
town
honor.
is being
A
attacked.
sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Is there danger? Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. For my father, the king. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Feel my wrath. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. For honor. The light is my strength. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
Feel my wrath. You are past redemption.
For honor. Of course.
Feel my wrath.
Justice shall be done. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. For my father. Certainly.
Betrayer of the light.
For honor. Of course. For honor. The light is my strength. sound plan. For honor. Is there danger?
Our
Certainly.
allied town is being
For
attacked!
honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Is there danger? Justice shall be done. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. I stand for the light. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
Our allied town is being attacked!
Sound. Certainly. Of course. For Lord Orion. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
Justice!
For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
You are past redemption.
Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan.
Justice is come.
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
Feel my wrath.
Of course. Certainly.
Foul knave.
Of course. Certainly.
Justice has come.
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
Our allied hero has been slain.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan.
Our allied hero has been slain.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Feel my wrath.
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
For my father, the king.
Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Is there danger? Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For Lord Orion. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Foul knave. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Justice has come.
For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Justice shall be done.
You are past redemption.
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
Feel my
Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
justice has come.
For Lord Oran. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Foul name. A sound plan.
Our allies hero
I stand for the light. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. I'm here to help. A sound plan. For honor. For Lord Oran. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For my father, the king. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. I stand for the light. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. I'm here to help. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
Our allies hero has betrayal of the light.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. For my father, the king. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Is there danger? I stand for the light. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. The light is my strength. I'm here to help. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. I stand for the light. The light is my strength. For honor. Certainly. I stand for the light. Light is my strength. For honor.
Our allies' hero has
Certainly.
been slain.
For honor. For honor. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For Lord Oran. A sound.
Our allies' house is being attacked.
Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
Justice is found. Our allied town is being attacked.
Certainly. Is there danger? I stand for the light. A
Our
sound.
allied town is being
Of
attacked.
course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.